Hello and welcome to another edition of Up Close. I'm Don McIntosh.
And I'm Shelley Quinn.
And we're coming to you from the Three Angels Seventh Adventist Church in Wichita, Kansas. We're happy to have a live audience joining us today, and we're glad that you're joining us too.
Today's program will focus on a hidden problem that is becoming more widespread among all age groups in our fast-paced society. That problem is a feeling of isolation that we commonly call loneliness, a condition that is not necessarily caused from being alone. At some point, each of us will likely experience a temporary sensation of loneliness during our lifetime. But in today's environment of endless opportunities for entertainment and excitement, it is surprising that more and more people are being overwhelmed with the melancholy feeling of being disconnected from the world around them. This condition can lead to even more serious problems.
Today we'll examine what the real cause for these forlorn feelings is and how to overcome a lonely state of mind.
Don, let me ask you a question. Have you ever experienced that real sense of deep loneliness?
Well, I don't know if people can identify with my sense of loneliness, and maybe I can't with theirs. But yeah, I think I've gone through times of loneliness, for various reasons at different times. What about yourself?
I've had some times of intense loneliness. I think one of the worst times was when I had gone back to college, and I was 30 years old. Suddenly, I'd just broken off an engagement. And suddenly I found myself in an environment with people much younger than myself, very isolated, and it went on a long period of time. Even though when I was surrounded by other students and people that I interacted with all day long, I was very lonely. And I found myself going outside late at night, and I'd look up at the stars, and I would beg God to draw me closer to Him. It took me some time to understand that my loneliness was just an inner emptiness, that I was missing that relationship with God.
Well, one time I was lonely. Just a short-term loneliness was when the first time I went to a foreign country. Yes. And I went there with no one else, no one that could really translate for me. And for those who know me, I talk a great deal.
Yes.
And so I couldn't talk, I couldn't understand, and it was a short-term loneliness, but I tell you, I didn't particularly like it.
Well, another time that I had a really intense loneliness was when I had become very ill, and we just had moved. I was taking care of my in-laws, living at a place several hundred miles from my home, and I had left my church, my friends, all of my belongings in Houston, Texas when we moved, and I felt so isolated, even though I was with loved ones, because my husband was traveling. I was in a new environment, sick, and trying to mask this sickness. And we're going to discuss tonight that sometimes when we have hidden problems that we are masking, that this can really create that sense of isolation and loneliness.
There are many people that we talked to in preparing for this program that didn't want to talk with us because it was kind of hard for them to admit loneliness. Some of them were maybe married to people that were very busy, perhaps professionals and whatnot, and they said, well, I just feel lonely, but if I say that, he or she will feel like it's their problem, and I don't really think it is. And then others said, well, I don't know that I want to share this or that. And it seemed to be mostly people that you would expect not to be lonely. They were surrounded by a lot of people. They had a spouse with them or whatnot. You would think things are going well, but they were lonely.
That's happened to me, and I bet it's happened to each one of us at some point in our life where we have that sense of deep loneliness and a longing to have something more in our life. But because of our pride, we mask that. And I remember once when I first graduated from college, I was in Las Vegas, Nevada. My company had sent me there, and they had me working there. And I was a very sheltered person. And here I am in Vegas, and I didn't want to go out and do anything in Las Vegas. And I remember that my boss, it was just before Christmas when we moved there. And my boss and his wife asked me if I would house sit over Christmas. And I'll tell you what, they had just moved into this new home, no furniture in the house, just one long-haired kitty cat that didn't like me very much and was constantly coughing up fur balls. And I ended up spending Christmas Day all alone, and that is one of the loneliest times that I've ever felt in my life.
Well, you know, I think we need to talk probably as we get into this program that there's probably some forms of loneliness that are okay. They're natural. There are some that are probably not okay.
That's true.
Sometimes if you're not lonely, it's a bad sign. Sometimes if you're lonely, it's a good sign, right? And so it can be, it's kind of a broad term. So we're in this program, we're going to be defining what loneliness is, at least to some extent.
Yes.
And we're going to be talking about valid types of loneliness and then some that maybe you really need to take a close look at.
And the reason this topic is so important, I know that for many of our viewers, you may be sitting there and you have this sense of isolation. One thing, if we don't learn what loneliness is all about and how to overcome loneliness, it can become a dangerous condition. Because loneliness is the threshold that opens up to depression and many other things. And you know, Don, a lot of people are trying to fill a void in them because they are so lonely. They're reaching out, they're doing drugs, they're filling the void with all kinds of bad things. And even a lot of young people who feel this intense loneliness are, as the song says, looking for love in all the wrong places. So we're going to talk about what causes loneliness, and we'll define it in a better way. And then we're going to talk about how to overcome loneliness. And this will be something I think that you'll enjoy very much.
Well, coming up next, we're going to be talking with two ladies who have been struggling with loneliness. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
Next week on Up Close.
We have some very special guests with us today. In fact, we have two families who've gone through the tragedy of losing a loved one. Mike Mckinnon from Tampa, Florida. Mike has been a biker for most of his life, and he lived a lifestyle that was not the healthiest.
But you never prepare for your child.
He was old enough to grasp. He says, "Mommy, people with cancer die. When will Daddy die?"
This Saturday on Up Close, Dealing with Death. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Up Close. Today we're talking about how to cope with loneliness. And our first guest is Shirley Garner from Wichita, Kansas. She worked for many years as a supervisor in an accounting department for an oil company. Over the last 14 years, she has suffered several serious health conditions and had major surgery several times. 10 years ago, tomorrow, her husband passed away. Let's take a look at what she had to say to us.
I've been coping with loneliness for a lot of years. My husband and I had cancer in 1990, and 4 years later he passed away. And that will be 10 years tomorrow, and there's been a lot of loneliness since then. He and I just thought alike and did things together and just enjoyed each other so much. And so there's a lot to try to cope with. We had a lot of couple friends, and fortunately I've been able to keep them all. And I think that's been good for me to be around couples, but at the same time, I'm a third leg, and I don't know whether you ever get over that or not, but I do appreciate that they continue being friends with me all these years. Some of the things that I know make me lonely is we visited all the time. When we sat in the car, we held hands even after all these years, and it's hard to sit at the table and eat. No conversation. In the beginning, it was so quiet because we always talked. And my son told me, he said, "Turn the radio on, and turn it on in a couple of rooms." And so there's noise in the house. And so I have Christian stations on, and I listen to those. We did a lot of camping and fishing when he was alive. And I live on water now, and I see people out with their boats. and their kids. And I can't do that, and I just think, oh, if he was here, we'd have such a good time. And that's hard to cope with. It's hard to see even older people together, maybe holding hands or smiling. I just, it brings back what was going on with me. And I don't have that anymore.
You can really sense the loneliness there, can't you?
Yes, I can. Shirley, I'm just really sorry for the loss of your husband, and I know that, what widows and widowers go through is when you've lost a loved one to death, it's like you have to redefine your life. And sometimes some people find that more difficult, and it sounds like you've been having a pretty difficult struggle with loneliness.
But I don't grieve. I don't cry. There's none of that. It's just being alone.
Did you go through the natural grief process for a while?
Actually, I didn't. My husband fought cancer for 4 years, and the first 2 years while he was ill was my grieving time. And when he passed away, I was glad I didn't see the pain anymore.
Okay.
So there was never grieving afterwards, so to speak.
Well, and that may be part of the reason I'd like to talk to you after the program. That may be part of the reason you're finding such a difficult time after 10 years of going through this.
Shirley shared with me later that there were some things that are very helpful to her, and I think we'll come back to those a little bit later.
Yes.
But, why don't we talk about what a definition of loneliness is? It's quite a broad category to define, but Shirley, what would you say is a definition of loneliness?
Well, loneliness is really a sense of isolation. It's a sense of inner emptiness. And what we find is that there are many things that cause this sense of being shut off from the world. I made a list of things because as I was planning this program, I was thinking back over some things that I've experienced in life, some things that I have counseled with others. And there are natural times of loneliness in our life that we really shouldn't worry about. For example, the loss of a loved one. When you lose someone to death, it is a very difficult and trying time, and it's natural during the grieving process and even after the grieving process to sense that loss, and you have that loneliness. The Lord, in Genesis 2:18, God said, "It is not good for man to be alone."
Amen.
And
I agree with that.
He did not really create us to live isolated. So loss of a loved one is definitely one of the first things. Now, separation from a loved one as well. You've heard of the empty nest syndrome. Mm-hmm. When children go off to college, and what often happens is parents, particularly mothers, will go through an intense time of loneliness, and it seems that nothing can console them because they are missing those children. If you have a child even that marries, then sometimes parents go through that. And it is interesting, as I've talked with some, many times the father, if they lose the daughter to marriage, and that's what most daddies will say it, I've lost my little girl to another man, the father is the one that sometimes has a more difficult time with the daughter marrying, and then sometimes the mother with the son. But anytime we are separated, just think of all the people whose spouses are in the service right now and maybe overseas. That's a natural time of loneliness in our lives. Abandonment is another issue. Abandonment, rejection, and isolation. People caring for someone who's chronically ill, like an Alzheimer's patient. When we actually did a program with a woman who had gone into depression, an up-close program, and she had cared for her husband during his decline through Alzheimer's, and she became necessarily more isolated because he was homebound, then she became housebound. And after his death, she had already isolated herself, and she went through an intense time of loneliness with him but she didn't do anything to change the conditions after the death, and she just slid right into the pits of depression. Let me give you another one. Strained marital relationships. You mentioned earlier when we were doing the introduction that sometimes we had a difficult time finding guests for tonight because some spouses might be a little reticent about getting up and saying,
I'm lonely even though I'm married.
I'm lonely even though I'm married.
Right.
I had a dear friend who was married to a rancher, and she said something to me that I will never forget. She said she was home alone all during the day, but what happened, she said, Shelley, I've never been more lonely than when my husband comes in the evening, because he will walk in the door, eat his dinner, sit in front of a television, and not talk with me. There is no communication. Here she'd been alone all day long, and then she said his presence in the room, but with that barrier up, makes me feel 100 times more lonely than when I'm alone.
So loneliness really is not the same as just being alone.
No, actually, a lonely person can be lonely in a room that is crowded with people. If you have that inner emptiness going on inside of you, it is something that's very difficult.
Would you say that's true, Shirley, in your situation, that, there's a difference between being lonely and just being alone? Explain what you mean by that a little bit more, maybe.
Well, it's just like she said, that there can be a lot of people around you, and like I'd said before, maybe they're couples, and that makes you lonely.
So even though you're with people, it just triggers a remembrance of
Right.
of the sense of
Of
loss
my
or
relationship.
of something that was an ideal or a more ideal time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me just give you a few more, Don, because we want to come back and discuss how to overcome this. But if you're single beyond the expected age of marriage, you talk to a lot of women who are 30, 35 years old, and all of their friends have married. They become very lonely because society expects something else of them, and their expectations are different. A natural kind of loneliness is when you relocate to a new town, or for children, to a new school, and you don't know anyone. Lack of social skills is one great contributor to loneliness. There are some people who don't know how to be a friend, and chronic illness can be a cause for loneliness. If someone is shut in because of injury or illness, lack of purpose in our lives. There's some people that seem to have it all, and they may be very wealthy, they may have all that we would think that should make their life happy, but if they don't have a purpose in their life, they can be very lonely individuals. And of course, the greatest one, and some of these are actually overlapping, but just that inner emptiness, people who are seeking something, and I am a firm believer that if you have a really intimate relationship with Jesus, that you will never be lonely again. So we're going to be discussing some ways to overcome these causes of loneliness.
Coming up next, we'll introduce you to yet another person that is trying to cope with the feelings of loneliness. So please stay with us. We'll be right back.
Are you alone? Do you feel the emptiness of being all alone even when others are around? If so, we have just the book for you. Find comfort as you read Alone Again. For your free gift, just write to us today at Up Close, Post Office Box 220, West Frankfort, Illinois, 62896. Or call during regular business hours, 800-752-3226 or 618-627-4651. Ask for Up Close offer number 13.
Welcome back to Up Close. Today we're talking about how to cope with loneliness, and our next guest is Cecilia Hudson from Wichita, Kansas. Cecilia works at Wichita State University as an administrative assistant in the engineering department. She has been a single mother for the last 10 years and has 5 children ages 11 to 25. She, too, has struggled with loneliness, but for Cecilia, it started much earlier in her life. Here's what she shared with us.
Most of my life, as a child, I came from a large family, didn't get some of my needs met, and was insecure. And as I grew up, I got into a relationship that I didn't necessarily seek God's guidance, and was lonely in my marriage. Didn't have a close, intimate relationship, and ended in divorce. And now I'm a single parent and have been for about 10 years. And it's hard at times to know that you're on it by yourself. And my boy's father passed when they were young, so I am by myself. And it's even hard as an adult with my parents sometimes. I changed denominations, what I grew up with, and I felt alienated for a long time from my family, so I didn't have a close group for support. I know that through your life, pretty much everyone has went through a lonely phase, and I've been married and now I'm not, but I know even as I was married, I was lonely at times. I didn't have that emotional connection with my spouse, and there's, I'm sure, many people out there that are in a spot where they're lonely, mixed up. I remember when I was married and I would feel like I needed to talk about something or needed some communication, and I would try to bring something up that was bothering me without attacking, and it just wasn't happening. We weren't communicating, and I just felt very alone. I felt trapped. Like, is this my fault? I blamed myself, and I just didn't know what to do. I felt alone, and I wasn't even the best parent I could be because of that. I had insecurities because I wasn't getting my needs met, and unfortunately I didn't go to the Lord soon enough for help, because He can change anything miraculously.
That's a great summary of many different touch points that you talked about, really, in defining or talking about people that experience loneliness. You know, the loss of a spouse, being a single mom, not having... The other thing I think that in that clip we heard was kind of an insight from that time of marriage where people that are married were having a hard time sharing with us or not wanting to, of course, in front of others, saying, here I'm lonely right in the midst of a relationship.
And then again, I think, Cecilia, what touched my heart was that you said you'd been lonely since you were a child, that often when we don't have our emotional needs met as a child, we grow up with that inner emptiness. And it sounds like that's what happened to you. Is that right?
Yes, and I also have fears that unknowingly I'll pass that on to my children, and that bothers me. So it makes me strive harder to find out an answer or improve myself.
Cecilia, when we talked as well, you have made some discoveries, some practical ways that have worked for you in terms of overcoming loneliness. And Shirley, also, when we talked with you, you also had some practical ways in terms of overcoming loneliness. And maybe, Cecilia, you can share a couple of those that you were talking with us earlier.
Yes, one that I remember, after I was a born-again Christian, I went to some conferences, and I was in a single support group at the time, and the pastor mentioned how many people are lonely out there and depressed and don't feel like they have a friend. And he talked about how instead of thinking of yourself like poor me and you don't have anybody, the real answer is to reaching out to others and being a good listener and being friendly and getting involved, and before you know it, your own goes away and you don't realize it.
Yes, and we're going to come back to that. And Shirley, there were several ways that you shared with us that you were coping with loneliness.
One of the main things is I'm a very outdoor person, and I love being out in the yard. And so the dirtier my hands get, the happier I am. But then about a year ago, I had a major melanoma, and that shut that off. And it was really hard on me, and then I prayed a lot about it, and the Lord says, you know, you can be nocturnal, you can follow the shade, and so that's what I do.
So you went outside still, but you worked in the shade.
Right.
That's right. Those are very practical things that have helped in some ways. And I know you had some other things, and we want to come back to that. But, Shelley, you have also some practical ways. You were sharing with me that as you've dealt in counseling with many lonely people that you wanted to share as well.
Well, and I think our ladies touched on many of them in just that short point of time. I'd like to give you 5 main points on how to overcome loneliness. And the first one is through group activities. I want to say this in a very sensitive way, because when you are lonely, you have such pain, and I don't want anyone to feel like I'm pointing a finger, but loneliness has a lot to do with focusing on ourselves. And we're going to talk about the second category, about volunteering or helping others. But one of the worst things that you can do if you are feeling lonely is to stay in an isolated condition. So, for example, for Shirley, one thing that is very good, if you have gone through the death of a loved one, go to a grief recovery course. Go find other people in a support group. And you mentioned as well, Cecilia, that you went to one of these types of groups. This is very helpful to be able to talk about. It's natural to feel lonely after you've lost a loved one, either through death or divorce. But you want to get out where you can talk with others about this. If you're new in town, you know, and that's another kind of natural loneliness, like you were talking about going to Europe, where you don't know anyone, you don't know the language. When you're new in town, check out the churches, join a church group, join a health club, join Toastmasters, join something. You've got to get out. You can't keep yourself boxed in and sit and have a little pity party about your loneliness. You need to get out and reach out to others. Take classes. You can take art classes, music classes, join a quilting club. There's all kinds of things that you can do. And perhaps if you have a talent, like you're a good pianist, offer to give piano lessons. And then something that you mentioned, Shirley, was exercise, getting out of the house. I would recommend for someone who's lonely, exercise will do 2 things. Number one, if you get out of the house and say you're a walker, if you walk where a lot of people walk, pretty soon you'll pick up a walking buddy, most likely. Have you ever noticed how people start walking along the track, and the next day you go by and you see the 2 of them join together? But walking does something to help our brain develop. Exercise, fresh air, sunlight helps our brain develop more serotonin, and we have these things going on in us then that make us happier. Volunteer, the second category, is volunteer to help others. You can do this through community services. My sister Dawn called me. She was in Chicago, didn't know anyone. She was so lonesome, and she called and whining every day. I'm so lonesome. I'm so lonesome. Now, I should say she didn't know anyone. She was married. Her husband worked a lot of hours. And finally, about the 3rd or 4th day this was going on, I told her, honey, your focus is so much on yourself. If you want to overcome this loneliness, what you need to do is go down to the Salvation Army and volunteer, help people that are hungry, help, the homeless. And when she did that, suddenly, 2 days later, she called me back and she said, I'm not lonely anymore. So when we get our focus off of self, this is something that helps.
And I want to bring out that, Shirley, you shared how you started to do some of those volunteer things. What kind of things did you get into?
Well, because of my health, I'm not dependable, and I have to do things on my own time. And our church has a little school, and I pay the bills for the school and help in the library, and I have a little great-granddaughter I take care of once in a while. And
I see a big smile on your face
yes.
on that.
And I have a lot of friends. I've had a wonderful support group for many, many years. And
so it's a little baby and then getting involved in some of that. I was in a restaurant today with some of the crew here from up close. And they we got together. This is one of the last tapings of these segments that we're working on. and I had my little baby with me. And, you know, I was able to talk to complete strangers. I just took my baby along, and they started talking to the baby. And it really breaks down the barriers, doesn't it? Now, Cecilia, one thing that Shelley was sharing was these social groups. And when you and I talked, you found that that was helpful, but you also had a caution for single people that are going to social groups.
Yes. I've been to probably 3 over the years. And what I have found, so many of them turn into like a social club. Or they go and want to have fun, or they try to find a date or a mate. And I got uncomfortable with that because, for me, that's not the reason I'm going. And I wished they were more like, how can I be a strong, godly mom or a woman and focus on my relationship with the Lord? Because that ultimately is where you really find the security and peace. And helping others go through the pain that you've come out of. You know, you can relate what they've went through, and it just seems like there should be more support and reaching out instead of just how can we have a good time.
I think that's a great caution, isn't it?
It is, and I think that there's a great point here. A social group, if you're going through group recovery, this is something very different than the need that you're discussing. You know, there are times, and we'll get to that point here in just a moment, where we need to be looking for the type of spiritual fulfillment and nurturing that will bring us closer to the Lord. But one more thing that I wanted to hit on the volunteer, because some people say, oh, I don't really think that I'm one to go feed the hungry or volunteer at the hospital or go to the nursing home and visit the shut-ins. But you can run errands. You know, men can run errands for shut-ins. You can mentor someone.
Thank you for that vote of confidence.
Become a big brother or a big sister. If you are retired and if you've lost a spouse and you're retired and you have business experience, then you can mentor someone in a startup business. Start an incubator. Get some other people together with you and offer to help in some way. The whole point, be a surrogate grandparent. The whole point is when we quit focusing on self and begin focusing on service to others, that loneliness just dissipates. It's just like a black cloud goes away.
Yeah, I think keeping people busy, too. I mean, that's exactly what you're saying, yourself or others. My mother is kind of a master of that with my father because he's now retired. And I think that's another time of loneliness. People work their whole life. They have a focus on different things. And then if some of those opportunities shut down, then they kind of shut down. And so, you know, just a little idea. And now my dad's running all over, taking people here and there and different things. And his focus has completely changed.
Absolutely. And, you know, you mentioned the baby in your arms and how easy it was to meet people. I had a friend who was so desperately lonely after the death of her sister that it took 2 years. She was really getting into a deep depression. And I kept telling her, get a puppy, get a puppy. And when she got a puppy and then would start walking this puppy, you know, she took it out on the leash. She started meeting other people. But also the puppy needed her care. And suddenly her focus was on something else. It was a lot of company for her. So that's something that if you know, you want to be careful.
Don't get a Great Dane.
Yeah, you want to be careful to get a big puppy.
I had a lady once who got a Great Dane. The thing took off and drug her down the road.
Yeah.
And then she was so injured, she came into the emergency department. She met a lot of people, but that's probably not the way, right? Start out small. And if you have a big dog, keep it on a short leash. Now, you have some other things here. Volunteer to help others, and then the next one you were...
The third category is invest in your relationship with God and the church. And I think, Cecilia, this is where when you went to a group that was helping you in recovery, when it gets to that point of being a social club, you needed something more. It's time that we become active. Go to a church. Get involved with your church in a Bible study group.
And I wanted to play off these two with Cecilia and with Shirley. Shirley, you told me that one of the benefits of your time alone was some of this very thing. Remember? Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
I'm not sure what.
Well, when you said that as you were in that time of loneliness, you finally began to read the Bible a little more.
Okay. I did want to say though that I'm a do-gooder, and I had in the past have volunteered a lot of things at church, and I think that's one thing that's hard on me too is the fact that I I can't be the do-gooder I used to be. But I was telling Pastor Don that I've been a Christian all my life, and I really thought that I knew God. But after all of our illnesses, I found out that wasn't true. And so, you know, I started reading the Bible and watching 3ABN, and now I know that I'm saved. And if it takes ill health to learn to know the Lord, then that's what it takes.
And Cecilia, I think as well, you also talked about how in these times of loneliness you developed a relationship with the Lord in a way.
Yeah, that's really what keeps me going, because there's times I'm so busy with responsibility and the kids at home and my granddaughter that lives with me right now. So with a full-time job and all, and I just don't have time to get out and exercise, have a social life at all.
Right.
And so I don't do things that I should make more time for. But one thing I have found that is the most important is my devotion study.
Amen.
If I get away from my study and my prayer, I don't feel at peace is the same, and I start thinking of more lost. More.
You also told me that you had that peace, but you also, from devotional life, you developed a confidence to talk to people.
Right. I'm very quiet, and it's hard to get to know me. But if I'm really focusing on my devotion and working on me and that relationship with the Lord, I seem to be more secure, and I can more easily open up.
You know, Hebrews 13:5, Jesus said, "Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you." I think for me, I grew up in a very dysfunctional family, and I understand the pain you're talking about being a lonely child, because my father was killed at 6, my mother was manic depressive, she also became an alcoholic, and we had a white elephant in the living room that we weren't allowed to talk about. Do you know what I mean? Where when you're hiding a problem, we weren't allowed to discuss this beyond our home borders. And there's things that children can grow up and be very lonely. But this is something, as you mentioned, Shirley, about being a do-gooder and now you can't. There's always something that we can do. If you are a shut-in, then what you can do is write cards of encouragement. If someone is grieving over the loss of a loved one, or if they're celebrating the birth of a child, there's things that we can all do. We can become angels of mercy, putting together disaster relief baskets. Anything that we can do to reach out to others. But as Cecilia was saying, Don, for me the most important thing in overcoming my loneliness was having a very intimate, personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Right now, I have a very public ministry, so I'm with people quite a bit. The times that I am alone, which sometimes I just went through a 2-month period of writing a book. My husband was there, gone. I was alone except on Sabbath for 2 months. Never was I lonely one moment. It was a time of solitude, which is completely different than that time of feeling isolated. It looks the same. I was isolated, but in my mind, godliness with contentment is great gain. I pray for a divine awareness of God's presence in my life.
I think that's the key in many ways. Now, there are some people that are lonely just because they don't take a shower.
Yeah. Well, that is my next category.
Isn't that right? Bad breath,
Yes.
don't take a shower, unkept.
You know what they say, halitosis is better than no breath at all.
Right.
One thing, the fourth category
I didn't know they said that. I'm so glad I know that now. Yeah, but some people they turn people off.
One thing, the fourth category is invest in developing social skills. My aunt is 80 years old, and she is so active. She's very active in her church. She's very involved with her family. She exercises every day. She never has a lonely moment, even though she is a widow and was widowed several years ago. But she's so giving and outgoing. And her cousin, who's the same age, called her and said, "I'm so lonely. My kids just don't come to see me. They don't call." And the Lord graciously led my aunt and opened the door for her to talk about the reason they don't. She encouraged her to be more positive, because this poor woman was driving off her children. She was driving off her family.
By what? She would talk about negative things? Or
Negative, negative, negative. Complaining, complaining, complaining. If you sense, sincerely sense, that people are avoiding you, that people are shutting you out, what I recommend is finding someone that you trust and go to them with prayer and say,
why are people avoiding me?
and ask them,
right.
What is it about me that seems to make people want to avoid me?
Now, you need the prayer because you're going to get upset when they tell you, probably, right?
You want not to react defensively. There are some people, and I've actually counseled with a person who was a great gossip, very critical. Every comment that came out of his mouth was very negative, and he was wondering why no one wanted to be his friend.
You let him in on the secret.
I let him in on the secret. We've got to examine ourselves sometimes and see if our loneliness is self-induced.
Mm-hmm. Now, is he still your friend?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, the Bible says that the wounds of a friend are better than the kisses of an enemy. If someone does come to you and ask that question, you want to be very loving as you are giving them the advice. And I always use myself as an example, because I can put myself in just about any example and say, I've done this myself before, and this is what I've found. So it is very important that you do something to invest in developing social skills. We
have about 1 minute. And you have, I think, 2 other suggestions. See if you can summarize those in 1 minute.
I'll try to do that very quickly. Number 5 point is become friendly. You've got to be a friend to have a friend. Proverbs 18:24 says, a man who has friends himself must be friendly. You have to open up, smile, remember people's first names, listen. Become a good communicator. If you want someone to open up to you, ask questions and listen. They're going to love you. People love to talk about themselves. So you've got to reach out, let others know on holidays that I'm not doing anything. Do you know anyone else in the church or in the neighborhood who's not? Because I'd like to get a group of us together so that we can celebrate the holidays together. Either have a potluck or maybe go down and feed the homeless. So it's very important that what we've got to do is look to others, seek counseling, ask someone that you trust, what can I do to overcome this loneliness? Because if you don't, that loneliness can lead you into depression, or, as in Cecilia's case, when she was young, it can lead you into destructive relationships where you are trying to fill the void within with all of the wrong things.
Coming up next, we will take some questions from our live audience, so please stay with us.
Next week on Up Close.
We have some very special guests with us today. In fact, we have 2 families who've gone through the tragedy of losing a loved one. Mike Mckinnon from Tampa, Florida. Mike has been a biker for most of his life, and he lived a lifestyle that was not the healthiest.
But you never prepare for your child.
And he was old enough to grasp. He says, Mommy, people with cancer die. When will Daddy die?
This Saturday on Up Close, Dealing with Death. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Up Close. We're talking today about how to cope with the feelings of loneliness, and we're going to take some questions from our audience. Welcome to Up Close. What's your name and what's your question, please?
Phil, sometimes it seems like lonely people come to church so that they won't be so lonely. What are some symptoms and signs we can look for to make sure we recognize those lonely people to fill their needs?
Well, Phil, was it? It's sometimes very difficult to recognize a lonely person because so many of us come into a group setting and we have a mask on and we use verbal camouflage, and pride could be keeping someone from really speaking out. What we need to do is, number one, treat everybody as if their heart is breaking, because it probably is. You know, there's times when some people are very lovable and they attract us, and some people aren't very lovable and they may repel us. But what we need to do, particularly within the church and within the community, the church needs to reach out. If you know someone has recently been widowed or a widower, then you need to reach out. Invite them for fellowship. Invite them over after church. Invite them to come to some of your holiday meals. If you know someone has been recently divorced, you really need to be ministering. We were speaking during the break. Children, when parents divorce early, children have this loneliness that they sometimes grow up with. So we need to reach out to not only to the one who is in our church who is divorced, but to their children. We need, for the community, the church needs to reach out to help recovering drug addicts. They don't know how to even act in social, when we're talking about developing social skills, they don't know how to act around people. We need to reach out in so many ways.
So what you're saying is just act as though everybody's lonely.
Act as if everybody's lonely. One thing that
So when anybody comes in, no matter if they're the pastor or a parishioner, just say, I'm going to minister to this person as though no one else had talked to them.
Absolutely.
Now let me just say something about that. I used to work with a group of emergency department physicians, 7 of them, very highly trained, professionals, then other physicians. You would think they had everything, in terms of their profession and different things. But I can remember going into their cubicle where they sat in between patients after they had just a few moments. And I remember one day I asked one of them, very excellent doctor and different things. I was just basically asking him, I said, are you lonely? Well, I got to know him better at that time. Mm-hmm. And he just opened up and he says, I'm the most lonely person you'd ever meet. And you would never have thought that. But I think that's a good rule, to treat everybody as though they are lonely. We have another question. What's your name? What's your question?
My name is Joyce, and I wanted to know what kind of activities can a church provide to help the lonely in the congregation?
What you can do is sponsor grief recovery courses, sponsor single moms courses. Some of the things that Cecilia mentioned that she wanted and needed when you were going through this. How to be a better mom, how to be a more godly parent and raise godly children. Or just, if start a sewing circle that you're going to produce goods that you're going to give to the homeless or that you're going to send for disaster relief. There's so many ways that you can reach out to people within your church and find out the needs. You know who's one of the loneliest groups in many churches? Who would you guess? Teenagers. There's not enough in the church for teenagers to do. They come to church and they hear great messages, but nobody's using their talents. Nobody is acknowledging the things, the many pressures that they face in the world. So you need to get teenagers more involved. Give them special assignments. Let them have, teach them how to do special worship. Teach them how to give a devotional. Send out in a church, you could send out a flyer in your bulletin asking, what kind of topics would you like to see here? What kind of groups what are your needs? Are we meeting the needs, or are we just doing what we've always been doing year after year, decade after decade, when the whole complexion of the church has changed because our world has changed?
We have another question. What's your name? What's your question?
My name is Cindy Seward, and in relation to these other questions, what are the different masks of loneliness, and is pride and arrogance a mask?
Absolutely, pride and arrogance is a mask. People become Now, what we have to remember is if someone is empty on the inside, I'm going to take this doctor, for example. They can be driving a Mercedes-Benz. They can have a great position, a great career. They might even, You might be surprised to find that in your churches there may be a family that seems to be a model family. It may be a pastor and his wife. The pastor's wife may be so lonely because the husband is investing all of his time ministering to others' needs, and doesn't have any time to minister to hers. So the masks, I believe that most people who act in a gruff fashion, most people who do put you off, there's that inner emptiness within, and it is a mask, and it makes them difficult to love. But if we recognize that their heart is breaking and they're just not showing it, then that's the people we need to reach out to the most. You know, one thing about loneliness, there is no age limit. We know of children in Romania, the babies, in the cribs, in orphanages that are not being cradled, they're not being nurtured, they're not having their physical and emotional needs met. These children develop this syndrome of isolation to where then it's hard to minister to them. So we can go from the cradle to the grave, that there are lonely people of every age group, and we need to pray and say, Lord, help us to recognize who's lonely, not only within my church, but Cecilia had mentioned there's so many single families in the community, mothers who are struggling to bring up their children by themselves. These women need help. I believe that one thing our church needs to do is start giving very practical seminars and inviting the community in, seminars dealing with finance, family dynamics, how to cope being a single mama in a world. People need to be mentored, and sometimes they don't know where to go to be mentored.
We have another question. What's your name and what's your question, please?
My name is Mika, and my question is, if a person is a loner is differently than a loneliness, right? Yes. You enjoy being by themselves, enjoying just spending time alone, reading, dreaming, or something like that. How do you do not to be confused with a loneliness, suffering of loneliness?
How do you know if, I believe, Mika, let me repeat your question so that I'm sure I have it. If you see someone who spends a lot of time in solitude, how do you know that they're not isolated and lonely? See, I'm one who truly, I have to have a certain amount of solitude. I don't function well without it. And sometimes if I have spent a number of days almost like a hermit, people get concerned, well, aren't you lonely and you need to get out? No, I don't. I'm out all the time. How you tell is if someone is able to give of themselves. Lonely people can't give of themselves. They find it very difficult because you can't minister from an empty cup. But if someone has great contentment in their life, ask, number one, Mika. If you see someone like that, ask them, are you lonely? Would you like to join us? And if they are very contented and you see that they function well in every other area, then there are people that like a lot of solitude.
We have another question.
You mentioned loneliness and depression several times. How can you tell when you're going from loneliness to depression, and when should you seek help?
Wonderful question, because as we have mentioned, there are times of natural loneliness. And it would be unnatural not to be lonely in certain situations. But when that loneliness becomes consuming, when that loneliness goes on for extended periods of time, the problem is that it can go into depression.
Right.
And when someone goes into depression, then there's some other signs that are going on and you need help.
Yeah, there are several resources you can look at for that. I think a great book is Dr. Neil Nedley's book, Depression, The Way Out, that has a list of 10 different signs you can look at to see whether or not you're depressed or lonely. And then you can seek that kind of professional insight to help you with if you have a question like that. And it is dangerous not to be treating things like depression that are clinical depression. Well, we have talked about a lot about loneliness. We've had some excellent dialogue. We've had some wonderful guests. But I want to ask you, Shelley, as we close up, just pulling things together, what is that last thing you want to say, that final thought that brings it all together?
Just speaking from my heart, I want to say there are so many lonely, hurting people in the world, and they need to be filled, I believe, by the power of God and the Holy Spirit. We have to be, first, we have to look at ourselves and say, am I truly experiencing the contentment and the zeal that God expects me to be experiencing? Is my church going religion or is it relationship? I think that God He is calling all of us into a more intimate relationship with Him. And the reason I'm emphasizing this, Don, is the more intimate our relationship is with God, the more we are filled, the more we can serve. And what I would say, I guess, is if we could look at people through the eyes of God. In 2 Corinthians 5, around verse 16, I believe it is, Paul said, we no longer look at anyone from a human perspective, even though we once looked at Christ that way. Well, how is it that you and I cannot look at someone from a human perspective? There's only one way. We've got to pray, and we've got to say, Father, help me to see others through your eyes. Help me, Lord, to be filled with your compassion, with your love. As Romans 5:5 says, and I pray it over my life all the time, shed your love abroad in my heart. Pour your love into my heart by the Holy Spirit. God, make me a better lover of the souls of the people that you love so much.
We want to thank our guests today, Shirley Garner and Cecilia Hudson, for being with us. It's been great to talk about this with you, Shelley, and my thought as I've listened to this is always drawn to our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, who came to this world from heaven, and He was lonely because He was no longer with His Father and with all of those people in the heavenly courts. And yet, He came down here and lived among men, and He came to His own, and His own received Him not. In fact, in the Garden of Gethsemane, He said, why have you forsaken me? And then He died on a tree for you and me, and He took all the loneliness of the world on His shoulders. And so as we close this program, maybe it would be something of value if you would say, Lord, I want you to take my loneliness. You've already borne much of it. And I want you to come into my heart, into my life. I believe He'll do it. He did it for Elijah. When Elijah ran far away into the wilderness one time, the Lord said, what are you doing here? And He cooked him a nice meal, and He helped him out, and He got him back on the road. And I believe the Lord wants to do the same with you. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Shelley, for being with us, and may God bless you.